now is the crunch time. Now is the moment. Now is the time that you should do this, because if you do it, then the entire negotiation changes.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've spoken to Sir Bill Browder again about what a big weekend he had at the Munich Security Conference. He's spoken to many world leaders and former foreign ministers about confiscating that $300 billion of frozen Russian assets and putting it into Ukraine so they can fight this war on their own terms. He thinks that this is crunch time and this is the thing that will change the war. We've also spoken to him about Marco Rubio's visit to Saudi Arabia today, where he will begin these early negotiations. So much going on today on the Trump Report. So Bill Browder, thank you for joining the Trump Report today. I know that you have had a busy weekend at the Munich Security Conference and so much has happened even in the days after that. But I want to get your thoughts to start off on Trump telling reporters yesterday that Ukraine would be involved in peace deals, and that after Steve Witkoff's 3-hour conversation with Putin the other week, they're very much under the impression that Vladimir Putin wants fighting to stop. What are your thoughts on that? Do you believe him?
Well, I mean, first of all, Ukraine has to be part of any peace deal because there are two warring parties, Russia, the invader, and Ukraine, the defender. And you can't really have a peace deal if both parties aren't at the table to agree whatever the terms of the peace are. And so, well, this whole concept that somehow Ukraine is going to be excluded is just, some strange nonsense. At the end of the day, Ukraine and Russia will have to agree to whatever terms they agree to or not. The idea that Putin wants peace, if he wants peace, he shouldn't have invaded. At any point in time, up until this minute, he can withdraw his troops and have peace. It's really not that much to say. And so I think that all this is just Putin's fake out strategy. He does this regularly during negotiations. He says all sorts of things he doesn't mean. He will make all sorts of promises that he doesn't keep. And so it's a highly fraught process that probably won't bring the result that anyone who cares about Ukraine wants.
What will happen, though, Bill, if Putin has a hard line that he just will not negotiate if Ukraine are present?
Well, I mean, there's two possible scenarios. The first and desired scenario would be that if Putin takes a hard line, then Trump says, okay, it's obvious you can't negotiate, and therefore we will double down on helping Ukraine. That's unlikely based on everything that Trump has said. A more likely scenario is that Trump will accept whatever Putin wants, and then the two of them will try to shove it down the throats of the Ukrainians and the Europeans, which is the tone that they gave at the Munich Security Conference last weekend.
And then we've got obviously a new problem we're facing now is Europe also not being involved in these peace talks, and Russia's foreign minister Sergei Lavrov, he said yesterday that Europe has had their chance to be in the negotiating table, and he's not quite sure what they would even contribute to talks if they were to be involved. Is Europe just completely left out of the dark now, Bill?
No, not at all. I mean, to the extent that Trump is promising European troops to be the peacekeepers, then Europe has to be at the table. Furthermore, I think it's a bit sort of insulting and disingenuous for them to say that Europe hasn't been a part of the process. If you look at the total aid given to Ukraine, Europe's aid has surpassed the United States' aid. And so I think that, the one thing that Trump is right about is that Europe hasn't pulled their weight on a defense basis for a long time, for many decades. Europe has not invested in their defense, and so Europe has relied on a very large contingent of NATO troops to sort of create a deterrent. And it looks increasingly likely like that that the United States is going to be focusing their defense efforts on China, not on Europe. And in the worst case scenario, we may see a total withdrawal of American troops from Europe.
Yes, there is speculation that the US will be withdrawing completely from Europe, but there's also concern that the US will start to withdraw from NATO soon. Bill, do you see that on the cards, especially after the weekend that you just spent in Munich?
Well, I've seen this on the cards since probably 2018. There's a book written by the President Trump's previous national security advisor, John Bolton, where he discusses Trump's total disdain of NATO and how he wanted to withdraw from NATO in his first term, and that it required all the guile and cleverness of Bolton and others around Trump to sort of distract him to do something else at the time. And so I think it's entirely likely, and I would say even probable, that the United States either withdraws from NATO or basically says, that the NATO Article 5 guarantee is not ironclad. That's sort of, NATO is both a physical defense force, but more importantly, it's a symbolic deterrent that any enemy of NATO countries has to contend with the idea that everyone will work together in a mutual defense pact. If that doesn't happen, then it's every man for himself.
Absolutely. It's been a strong alliance, especially the last few years. But Bill, getting into what's going to happen today, we've got Secretary of State Marco Rubio in Saudi Arabia meeting with his Russian counterparts to start these early stage negotiations to end the war. What do you think will come out of these talks today?
Well, my impression is that this is a very long-term process. And the talks today are not about anything to do with war or peace. The talks today are to do with the scheduling a meeting between Trump and Putin. And so I suspect it's all about logistics and, formalities as opposed to, some type of peace negotiation.
And then on the other hand, we've got European leaders having held that emergency summit in Paris. Have you heard how that discussion has gone?
They've been remarkably quiet in terms of public announcements, which suggests to me that there's lots of disagreement behind the scenes. It's very difficult to get 27 countries to agree to something over the course of 2 days after all this fireworks in Munich and elsewhere. And so I suspect that whatever comes out of Europe is going to take some time to get consensus and agreement. And the fact that there was no announcements suggests that that's the case.
Bill, with so much discussion over whether or not Europe will be involved in these peace deal discussions and Russia saying that they don't want Ukraine at the table, why do you think Vladimir Putin is so hell-bent that he only wants to negotiate with Donald Trump? Do you really think that Putin believes that Trump is going to give him what he wants?
Yeah, I think that everything that we've seen so far, the body language, the reading between the lines, everything suggests that Trump basically favors Putin and kind of wants this war to end on Putin's terms.
Do you think there is a chance, or I guess it could be more of a conspiracy theory, that Trump is acting in a certain way to blindside Putin when in reality he is on the side of Ukraine prospering and in the side of involving Europe?
Well, the one huge piece of evidence against that is this deal that he tried to do with Zelensky, where he sent Scott Bessent to Ukraine with a contract to say to the Ukrainians, we want you to sign over all of your natural resources into perpetuity in exchange for all the military aid that we've already given you. It was sort of the most unacceptable deal I could have ever imagined. It was all very upsetting to read about, and it suggests that Trump has really no sympathy for Ukraine whatsoever.
What do you think it says about the state of the relationship between US and Ukraine right now? One source said that this contract basically meant pay us first and then feed your children, was the premise of the $500 billion payback contract that he sent Zelensky last week.
Yeah, it's an unacceptable. It's not just unacceptable; it's infuriating. Ukraine is the victim of this war, and all of a sudden the victim has to pay reparations to the United States. I've never heard of such a thing. And according to the estimates, the percentage of their GDP that they were supposed to pay off to the United States was greater than what Germany had to pay after World War I from the Treaty of Versailles, which of course was what led to the Second World War. And so for anybody to look at that as and not be disgusted, I mean, it's you know, it was the most unreasonable, unacceptable thing ever, and the fact that they put that in front of the Ukrainians right now is really very disconcerting.
But has Zelensky signed off on it, Bill?
No, Zelensky said absolutely not, under no circumstances. He said that deal is unacceptable. I would say the deal that Zelensky wanted is a deal where basically in exchange for some natural resources, Ukraine would be able to maintain its sovereignty and get the protection of the United States going forward. And that wasn't a deal that was being proposed.
Retired General Jack Keane, he said that Putin will basically wait out Trump's term the next 4 years and then take Ukraine. You've been pretty adamant that, you know, that Russia, if we give them an inch, they'll take a mile. So it's important to basically cut it off now. Do you think that that is true, that whatever deal Trump may broker with Putin, he does plan to eventually in 4 years take Ukraine?
I disagree with that. I think he's going to try to take Ukraine much sooner than 4 years, but he doesn't have to do it on the battlefield. I mean, one of the things that Trump is like adamantly, or I should say that Putin is adamantly proposing, is for elections to happen in Ukraine. And I think he'd like elections to happen. He'd like to see Zelensky gone. He'd like to see some person that Russia supports getting all sorts of support from Russia in a campaign, and then take over Ukraine that way. I mean, there's a lot of different ways of taking over Ukraine other than militarily, and I think that Putin has every intention of taking it a lot sooner than 4 years.
Bill, have you, as I've mentioned, you've just been in the Munich Security Conference where there were a lot of high-profile people and big players in this kind of area. Did you speak to anyone from the Trump administration when you were there?
No, but I did have a chance to speak to many people on both sides of the aisle in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives. And it's an interesting situation where Democrats and Republicans are in Congress, in the Senate and the House of Representatives, are fully aligned with each other on what to do about Ukraine, which is to support Ukraine and to fight Putin. And I was there, met with Lindsey Graham, with Senator Roger Wicker, with all sorts of different people on the Republican side, and their position was exactly the same as those on the Democrat side, which is that Ukraine is our friend, they should be our ally, and that Russia is the enemy, and that we should do whatever we can for Ukraine. And so the position of the Trump administration is not a Republican position, it's a Trump position, which goes against everything that's been sort of agreed and the conventional wisdom of all people I know in Washington.
So you do think that a lot of, on a bipartisan level, a lot of people are not in agreement with the way that Donald Trump's handling the situation?
Yeah, I think that behind the scenes the Republicans in Congress are furious.
Bill, you've obviously been very outspoken on Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin's regime, especially in the last 5 years. But in the last 2 weeks, you've been doing a lot of media interviews with me. You've been in Munich. You've been very outspoken, especially because it does feel like right now it is crunch time as the US and Russia deliberate over this. Have you heard from anyone from Putin's side? Because as you've pointed out to me, he's not your biggest fan.
Well, I'm sure that they've got me on their list, and I'm sure I'm high on the list, but it doesn't usually come from conversations with them to know how angry they are. It usually comes from some other nasty thing that they're doing next, whether it's another assassination attempt, arrest warrant, lawsuit, or whatever. So I expect more trouble to come in the future.
Oh, well, you're a brave man, and we appreciate it for you. But just a final question, Bill. When you were at Munich, you were very much adamant that you were going to speak about the confiscation of this $300 billion of frozen Russian assets, and then in turn put it back into the hands of Ukraine to be able to fight this war on their own terms. What was the update when you were away with these big leaders? Is it a common conception that perhaps we should be unfreezing this money?
Yeah, I think this is the solution to the whole problem, and this was my main and only message at Munich. And I had meetings with more than half a dozen foreign ministers from Europe, and I basically said, I don't know why anyone is talking about anything else other than confiscating the $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves that you hold. And my logic was very simple, which is that if Trump's leverage in forcing a bad deal on Ukraine is the idea that America will cut off military aid, then the way to basically take away that leverage is for Europe to say that we'll pick up the slack. And for Europe to pick up the slack without having to go to the taxpayers, the easiest way to do that is to confiscate the $300 billion of Putin's money and let Putin pay for it. And I basically said to them that, now is the crunch time, now is the moment, now is the time that you should do this, because if you do it, then the entire negotiation changes. And I got a full, absolute agreement from the foreign ministers that I spoke to. And the key question, I think, is what does Germany do? Germany doesn't have a government yet because they're having elections on Sunday. And that will, whoever the German chancellor is, I think will determine the outcome of that question. And that could very well change everything in this negotiation.
Interesting. I will be waiting for Sunday then, Bill Browder. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.